That said, let's pick up where we left off last week. We've been talking about our 12 periods of Old Testament history. This is an overview of the Old Testament, but we're breaking it down into these 12 periods of history. Each one of these we used kind of as a memory tool, the face of a clock. The antediluvian period being number 1, or before the flood. Post-diluvian, number 2, or after the flood. 3 being patriarchal, different from what is often called the patriarchal dispensation. This is a period of history different from that. 4, bondage and Exodus. 5 is where we're finishing up today, the wilderness wanderings. I guess that should be plural there, wanderings. 6 is conquest and possession. May get into that one today. We may finish right at the beginning of it. We'll see how it goes. 7 is judges. 8, united kingdom. 9, of course, is divided kingdom. 10, Judah alone after the fall of the northern kingdom. Judah is left alone there in the south. 11, both kingdoms are in exile or captivity, either way you want to refer to that. And then 12 is the restoration, where the tribes are allowed to return to their homeland. It goes to the end of, chronologically, to the end of Nehemiah's work. Again, we've been talking about period number 5, wilderness wanderings. I'm going to cover these quickly because this is just a review. I know it's been 2 weeks off, but hopefully you remember these. Period number 5 covers from the crossing of the Red Sea to crossing the Jordan River. Where do we read about it in the Bible? Exodus 15 through the end of the book, 15 through 40. The whole book of Leviticus, which occurs over about a year period at Mount Sinai. No, I didn't correct that in my PowerPoint. I meant to do that. Busy week. 3 months, about 3 months. Make sure I got 2 months. Somebody write that down and remind me next time when I say it wrong, you correct me. About a 2-month period at Mount Sinai. They were at Mount Sinai for a total of about 1 year. Leviticus occurs during about 2 months of that 1 year. So I had doubted myself on that, and I was thinking, no, Leviticus occurs over that whole 1 year, but it doesn't. And I meant to correct it on the PowerPoint. So Numbers and Deuteronomy, again, the whole books, those entire books occurred during this period. Joshua 1 and 2. I was thinking about this morning, and if sometimes it may help you just to simplify, and if you want to just say the rest of Exodus, all of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, I don't think you're going to be too off, although technically, if you want to look in Joshua chapter 3 is where they're going to cross the Jordan. And so we say this period ends crossing the river Jordan. That technically happens in Joshua 3. So Joshua 1 and 2, could even technically say a part of 3. But if it's easier just to remember those other 4 books, I don't think you're going to be so off that it's a huge deal. And if you want to think of period number 6, the conquest and possession, well, that's the book of Joshua. Again, you're not going to be so off. Sometimes we've used approximate breaking points as far as the references. Important places in period number 5. Mount Sinai obviously plays a major role here. Kadesh Barnea and the wilderness of Paran. These are where the 12 spies were sent out from. The wilderness, there are just a lot of places, numerous places where they wander. They'll stop for a time. They'll move again. How do they know when to stop? The cloud. What about it? The cloud stops. I know where you're going with that. I'm being difficult. That's right. The cloud stopped if it's daytime, and if it's nighttime, the pillar of fire. And so that it was a pretty simple system, right? The cloud moves, pack everything up. We're moving. And you move until the cloud stops. And when the cloud stops, you unpack, you set up the tabernacle after Exodus 40 when it's set up, and you stop. And then you don't move again until the cloud moves. Again, pretty simple system. And we talked about that. That's going with God. It's following his authority. When he moves, we move. If he says stay still, you stay still. It's not complicated to understand. It's just sometimes in life, being tempted and having things that'll sidetrack us, it's easy to fall out of practice that. But it's a simple concept to understand. Mount Nebo. This is where Moses would go up and view the promised land before he died. I don't think we got to that yet as far as Moses, why he didn't go into the promised land. Probably most of you are familiar with that, but we talked about important people. Moses, this all occurs during that last 40-year period of Moses' life. We divided his life, remember? Well, we didn't divide his life, but his life divides into 3 40-year periods, 40 years growing up basically in Pharaoh's household. His mom put him in the water so he wouldn't be killed, and just hope for the best, trust to providence, and God's providence is at work. Pharaoh's daughter comes down there. She finds him, has compassion. She wants to keep him, and even Miriam is there. Miriam says, hey, you want me to go find one of the Hebrew women to nurse him for you? Sure. So, of course, she goes and gets Jochebed, his mother. But he grows up in Pharaoh's household during that first 40-year period. His mom, no doubt, had a great influence on him, because you see that when he's standing up for his people. He kills an Egyptian. It's known. He has to flee. So 40 years in the wilderness of Midian, keeping sheep for his father-in-law. He goes off, of course, and meets Zipporah, his wife. And that 40-year period is spent in the wilderness. And then God appears to him in the burning bush there near Mount Sinai, near the base of Mount Sinai, and says, you're going to lead my people back here. Moses, who was all gung-ho 40 years or so previous, now has all. But God says, you're the man for the job. And so Moses finally gives in and decides he's going to do what God wants him to do. And he becomes one of the greatest leaders ever in the history of Israel. Miriam, Moses' sister, we mentioned her already. Aaron's sons. Aaron, of course, is Moses' older brother. Exodus 6:23, Numbers 3:2. You can read about his sons, Nadab and Abihu. I think we talked about this last week or 2 weeks ago. They died in Leviticus 10:1 and 2 when they offered strange fire. It wasn't just odd, weird. When you see that term in the King James, it means what? Unauthorized. So you see that a lot. In fact, me and the boys were listening to a sermon, I don't know, it's just been a couple of days ago or so, but it was a sermon by Eddie Brinkley. Strange things God hates. And he talks about strange fire, strange women, strange flesh. These are 3 passages. Oh, and strange doctrines. You read those phrases in Scripture 4 different times. I better stop there, because I might want to use that as a sermon sometime. So I don't want to elaborate too much on that. But it's interesting. The strange fires, the unauthorized fire here in Leviticus 10:1 and 2. They were supposed to take the fire off the altar. They got it somewhere else. We're not told where. We just know it was not where it was supposed to be from. Strange women. Again, it's not that they were just, man, you married these women. They were just kind of weird. They were foreign. And God is not racist. God does not have just something against other ethnicities or nationalities or races. That's not it at all. It's that they were idolatrous. And he warned them. He said, they'll turn your heart away from God. They'll turn your children's heart away from God. Don't give your daughters to them in marriage. Don't take their sons for your daughters. So he said, stay away from them. Solomon went and married all these foreign women, these idolatrous women, and they turned his heart away. And there were serious consequences for it. The strange flesh is a reference to Sodom and Gomorrah and the condemnation of homosexuality, going after strange flesh, unauthorized. God never authorized that, never has, never will. And then the strange doctrines obviously refer to, doctrine is just another word for what? Teaching. Sometimes people get all hung up about this word doctrine. I don't preach doctrine. I just stick to Jesus. Well, if you're teaching something about Jesus, you're teaching doctrine. That's just teaching. And strange doctrines are doctrines that are not authorized by the Word of God. But it's a very good sermon, and like I said, it'll preach. So maybe one time, I talked to Brinkley just a day or so ago, and he's doing well. He has some trouble with equilibrium, and so he's not able to get out and go to worship. But Sister Brinkley had me pretty excited, because she was telling me, she says, she was really, really bragging on Bremen and the congregation here, because she said, I'm just so glad y'all put those sermons on YouTube. And she said, I told a preacher friend of mine, I said, God, give us all wives that like that. Give all preachers wives like that, because she told me, she says, I can go and listen to Brother Brinkley on YouTube. She says, I miss hearing him preach. And she said, I'm so thankful for that. But she told me, she said, I got all these tapes. He's recorded his sermons for years. I got all these cassettes. I wish we had some way we could get those. And I said, we could do that. So we're working on that. We're trying to figure out a way. She's got to have somebody to help her get them together and ship them. And so my wheels are turning thinking about that, because that would be pretty exciting to be able to get that and put it on the internet, or maybe even they're audio only, but you could do like sometimes I see this with sermons from Brother Keeble. People will put just a picture of him on a YouTube video, and that's just up the whole time, and then the audio plays. So something like that. Aaron's sons also are important people in this section. Again, Nadab and Abihu, they died when they offered strange fire. Leviticus 10, 1 and 2. Eleazar is going to become the second high priest of Israel once Aaron dies. Ithamar is the one we just don't know a whole lot about. We're just not told a whole lot about him. Was he faithful? Was he unfaithful? I can't really tell you. We just don't know a whole lot about him. We know he's one of Aaron's sons, but that's about all we know. Joshua is the son of Nun, Moses' minister. He starts off helping Moses. Later on, he's going to take over and become the second leader of Israel. Exodus 33:11 and all of Joshua chapter 1, you see God encouraging him. And that's really neat to me to read Joshua chapter 1 and see, you got to be, if you're in Joshua's shoes, that's got to be a little nerve-wracking, right? I mean, you're following Moses, big shoes to fill. But God himself encourages Joshua. He told Moses, encourage him. But God himself actually encourages him there in Joshua chapter 1. Caleb, son of Jephunneh, he's also important in this period as he's one of the two faithful spies. This is where we left off. We covered this part of this slide. Israel's stay at Mount Sinai and Horeb. This is one of the important events in this period. I say Mount Sinai / Horeb. Why? It's the same place, just another name for it. So remember that when you see Horeb in Scripture. Sometimes it's just called Horeb or Mount Horeb. They stayed there again about 1 year. 2 months of that was during the book of Leviticus. Exodus 19:1, Numbers 10, 11, and 12 is how we date that. Important events at Mount Sinai. We began talking about this. I think we listed them quickly at the end of class 2 weeks ago. The law of Moses was given to Israel, Exodus chapter 20. You also see this referenced in Deuteronomy 5, 1 through 5. This is, important, and I'm not going to just rehash everything I said, because sometimes people, think, well, Mount Sinai, they received the Ten Commandments. And they did, but they received the rest of the law as well. It's not just the Ten Commandments. It's important to add Deuteronomy 5, 1 through 5 to this, because Moses calls all Israel, verse 1 of chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your ears this day, that you may learn them and keep and do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb." Again, that's Mount Sinai. "The Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. The Lord talked with you face to face, and the mount of the midst, out of the midst of the fire. I stood between the Lord and you at that time to show you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid by reason of the fire, and went not up into the mount, saying," and he goes on and mentions those 10 commandments there specifically. He says in verse 15, "And remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day." This is just important to note to whom the law of Moses was given, and that was to Israel. This law was never given to you or to me. It was not given to the Gentiles. It was given to Israel because God loved them more than anybody else, right? No. This is all about the Messiah. They are, we've used this term before, the nation of Israel is like the incubator for the Messiah. God does not just cut himself off from the Gentiles. I don't want anything to do with those people. They even had revelation. And sometimes God even sent prophets to them. Think Jonah. Jonah went to Nineveh, right? Well, it took some persuasion, but he went. God's not uninterested in the other nations. He's just focusing on this one because the Old Testament is all about how did we get to the Messiah. It's all about Jesus. Don't forget that as you study the Old Testament. I said that 2 weeks ago. I'm going to say it many more times because you got to remember that in the Old Testament. This is a focus on a purified nation God's own special people, a people for his own possession, literally. Not because he loves them more than anybody else, but because he made promises to Abraham, and he's going to fulfill those promises, and they're all leading up to the Messiah. Galatians 3:16. Don't forget that ever in your study of the Old Testament. Israel worshipped a golden calf. This is recorded in Exodus 32. Moses has been up on the mountain. He's just not coming back. So Aaron says, bring me all your gold. He fashions this golden calf. Of course, Moses comes down. He's furious. God tells him, you better get down there, Moses. Your people have deeply corrupted themselves. Moses comes down there. He's just so furious. And what does he do? He throws down the tables of stone in his anger, and he breaks them. Going to have to go back up to the mountain and get more. I noticed God doesn't actually, there's no record of God ever rebuking him for that. He almost like God says, yeah, you should be upset. Of course, Moses calls Aaron on the carpet for this. This is his older brother. But he knew he needed to be rebuked. And what was Aaron's excuse? He says, well, you know, they brought me all this gold, and we kind of threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. If you ever had your children tell you some wild tales to explain some of their antics, I imagine it'd be hard-pressed to top that one. We just threw the gold in the fire, and out came this calf. I don't know. Crazy thing, Moses, but that's how it happened. Well, as they say, if you believe that, I've got some oceanfront property in Arizona I'd like to sell you. So that's one of those important events at Mount Sinai. That happened at Mount Sinai, of course. The tabernacle was set up, constructed, built, with all its furnishings, and then set up. That's finished there, Exodus 40, verse 17. I believe that's the verse that says Moses finished the work. Let me get there. Well, 17, right? Oh, came to pass first month, second year, first day of the month, tabernacle was reared up. I'm thinking of verse 16. Thus did Moses according to all that the Lord commanded him, so did he. There's actually another one I was thinking of, and I thought it was right here. Well, anyway, it just simply says Moses finished the work. And there's also a phrase that I've kind of written down somewhere. I've never developed it into a sermon or article. And, here it is. It's Exodus 39:43. Moses did look upon all the work, and behold, they had done it as the Lord had commanded. Even so had they done it, and Moses blessed them. I like that phrase. I've kind of singled that out. At some point, I want to work that into maybe an article or maybe even a sermon. But I still haven't seen that phrase. It's in there somewhere where it just simply says Moses finished the work. 33 of what? 40? Oh, I knew I was probably looking right past it. Yes, 33. He reared up the court round about the tabernacle and the altar and set up the hanging of the court gate. And there's that simple sentence. So Moses finished the work. One of the things we're talking about this morning as a follow-up to 2 weeks ago, God is faithful, is talking about our own faithfulness, and that's what a faithful person does, right? They finish the work that they agree to do, in so much as they're capable and able. So Moses finished the work. Moses was faithful. But that's one of the major events that happened at Mount Sinai. Number 4 is the death of Nadab and Abihu. We talked about that. They offered that strange or unauthorized fire. It was supposed to come from off the altar. They didn't. They got it elsewhere. Seems in the context maybe they had been drinking, and that might have inhibited them in some way. And I don't know. Some people say that's just speculation. It may be that it's just coincidence that warning against priests consuming alcohol comes right on the heels of that, but it does seem like it might be related. I don't want to be dogmatic about that, but it certainly seems it would make sense. We'll put it that way. And then number 5 is, of course, the numbering of Israel's men of war. This happens in Numbers 1 through 3, and Numbers 1:46. You have a total of 603,550. That's fighting men, we would say soldiers. ages 20 and up. So that's not counting the women, that's not counting the young children. So those are, most people estimate a congregation of a nation of well over 1 million at this point. And people have all these kind of questions. Sometimes they'll say, well, how on earth could Moses possibly have communicated to that many people? How would they possibly have heard them? And I've even heard some commentators make observations about acoustics in this area, especially when you get to Deuteronomy, the Mount of Blessing and the Mount of Cursing, and the acoustics would allow the sound to bounce around, everybody be able to hear it. And I'm not saying that's not a possibility, but the God who can take water and part it, and you got a wall of water on your right hand, a wall of water on your left hand, and you walk through on dry ground, I don't think this is going to be an issue for him, okay? So however that happened, whether it was miraculous or some other way, it's not far-fetched to understand that and to believe that. More important verses and events. The 12 spies were sent to Canaan. This happens in Numbers 13 and 14. They come back, probably again, you're familiar with this, so I'm going to kind of condense it. They come back and they say, boy, the land is great. They even bring back some grapes, and they say, it's just everything God said it would be. Everything Moses has told us, speaking on behalf of God, and it's wonderful, but we can't take that land. I mean, there are giants there. We're like grasshoppers in their sight. There's no way. This isn't happening. So we need to just kind of go back to our own business. And in fact, the people, when they hear this, oh, man, they're just moaning and groaning, and they decide what we need to do is make us a new leader and go back to Egypt. Maybe the Egyptians will take us back. And sometimes they say, we remember how it was in Egypt. And every time I read that, I find myself kind of asking in my own mind, but do you? Do you remember how it was in Egypt? Because you're not remembering it the way I read about it in my Bible. They say, oh, man, we had the cucumbers and the garlic and the onions. And, of course, some people might say, that doesn't sound too enticing either. But they say, we remember all these good things. And I'm going, but do you not remember the beatings? The slave labor? And you moaned and groaned, oh, I wish God would remember us and deliver us from this oppression, this slavery. And he did, and now they're complaining about it. And, of course, you had two men, Caleb and Joshua. This is one of the reasons why they are two of the important people from this section. They stand up and they say, hey, hold on. If God delights in us, he'll bring us into the land. I mean, the God who parted the Red Sea and we walked through on dry land, the God who did those 10 plagues to bring Pharaoh to his knees when he consistently and persistently refused, hardened his heart, time and time again, even after the last time, chasing after us, hardening his heart again, and God destroyed him in the sea after we crossed on dry land and the waters come back and drown that whole Egyptian army. The God who did that, if he delights in us, he'll bring us into that land. He'll give it to us. Oh, no, we can't do it. It's just not going to work. And so God says you're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Why 40 years? God just liked the number 40. It's a year for each day the spies were gone spying out the land. That's why the number 40 was chosen. That's also about a generation. So 20 years old and upward, all that were numbered, he says, you're not going to go in. Your children that you said were just going to fall out here in the wilderness, they're going to see the land. And that's why you have the book of Deuteronomy. It's a repeating of the law for that new generation, a reminder. Deutero, second, nomos, law. The title is from Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It's not the second law, it's just the second giving of the law for that new generation. Kind of reminder to them, don't forget what happened. Learn from those mistakes of your forebears. So God says they're going to inherit the land, not those unbelievers. Hebrews 3 and 4 also deals with this, their lack of faith. But two people are, from that generation, going to get to see it. They are Caleb and Joshua, because they believed the Lord. They were faithful. Moses' sin, I referenced this just a moment ago. Again, I think it's familiar to most everybody, maybe everybody. Moses' sin was in Numbers 20, verses 12 and 24. By the way, it's interesting, if you want to, here's an interesting point to make. Maybe this might come up in a Bible study sometimes, because sometimes people want to know, why don't you have a piano or an organ or anything like that in the church? You know, you folks down here at the Bremen Church of Christ, you don't have that. Why don't you have any music? I tell people, number one, we do have music. It's just a cappella music. Not that it's not music, but there are no mechanical instruments of music. But in Exodus 17, 5 and 6, God tells Moses to go on before the people. Take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod wherewith thou smotest the river, take in thine hand and go up. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Guess what? He smote the rock, and water came out. But now you go to Numbers 20. Let me get over there. When you have a period that covers so much text, it's sometimes hard to get to the right passage. In Numbers 20, what did I say, 12? 12 and 24. You have God telling Moses in verse 12, well, that's after this happened. There's no water, verse 2. So they complain, oh, you brought us out here to die in the wilderness, verse 4. And they start remembering Egypt. They have selective memory, right? You know, oh, there's no seed or figs or vines or pomegranates here. There's not even any water to drink. So Moses and Aaron, they go before the door of the tabernacle, fall on their faces. The glory of the Lord appeared. Lord spake to Moses, saying, take the rod, gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his water. Thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock, so thou shalt give the congregation and their beasts drink. So Moses takes the rod. He's upset, and that's understandable, but it doesn't make it okay to disobey God, right? And so he says in his anger, hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? I don't know why he decided to say that. Must we fetch you water out of this rock? I know he knew and understood this was God's doing, but he's angry, lost his temper. Lifted up his hand with his rod, he smote the rock twice, but the water came out abundantly. I notice God's not punishing them for his sin. But he does say to Moses in verse 12, because you believe me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. By the way, that was said to Moses and Aaron. Aaron also would have gone into the promised land out of that generation of those above 20, but because he was part of this, he doesn't either. And then if you drop to verse 24, Aaron shall be gathered unto his people, for he shall not come into the land which I have given unto the children of Israel, because you rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. Now, I tie that with Exodus 17 because sometimes people, when they say this about, why don't you have any, you don't have a piano or drums or guitars or anything like that. And, sometimes, people, the simple answer I get to people is just simply not authorized in the New Testament. Colossians 3:17 says we ought to do all, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus. And that means by the authority. We understand that. If some policeman says you got to stop in the name of the law, it means by the authority of the law. And so people say, well, I know, but they use it in the Old Testament. Are you saying that was wrong? I'm not. In fact, there's a passage in 2 Chronicles where it says, that was the commandment of the Lord. But has there ever been a case, an instance in history where God told someone and authorized someone to do something on one occasion, but on another occasion he did not authorize it, and therefore that same action became sinful? And right here we have one. Moses smote the rock in Exodus 17, and God says, well done, essentially. But here in Numbers 20, he hits the rock, strikes the rock, and God says, because you believe me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the people of Israel, you're not going into the promised land. But you don't hear Moses going, well, it was right over there, so it must be right now. He understood the different circumstances. And of course, we're talking a different covenant altogether now in the New Testament dispensation. So that's just an important point to remember. Same action, right on one occasion, but not on the other. We got to go by what God says. And then, of course, the book of Numbers is the book of complaining, or the book of murmuring, we sometimes call it. Numerous murmurings in the wilderness from Israel. You have Korah's rebellion, Numbers 16, 1 through 3, also verse 11. They rebelled against Moses. You know, you take too much upon you, Moses. They're not saying this like, bless your heart, you're working yourself silly. That's not what they're saying at all. They're saying, who you think you are? You just try to make yourself Mr. Big Shot leader, huh? And Moses is saying, you know, I don't know if, I don't want to get too rampant with speculation, but not every word necessarily is recorded here. I kind of wonder if maybe in the course of this discussion, Moses doesn't say, hey, listen, when God called me to lead Israel, I wasn't chomping at the bit to do it. I didn't take this upon myself. God called me and numerous times said, Moses, you are my chosen man for this job. Moses didn't take this upon himself. So they gathered against him, Korah, Dathan, Abiram. Even have the sons of Eliab, On, sons of Peleth, On the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben. These are men from the tribe of Reuben. But if you go to verse 11, he says, for which cause both thou and all thy company are gathered together against the Lord? And what is Aaron that you murmur against him? So they end up being swallowed up. The earth opens up and swallows them up. In fact, Moses even says, where is it? Where the earth opens up. He tells them in verse 26, depart, I pray you, from the tents of these wicked men, touch nothing of theirs, lest you be consumed in their sins. Oh, here it is, verse 29. If these men die the common death of all men, or if they be visited after the visitation of all men, in other words, if they die like just a normal person might die, well, then the Lord hath not sent me. The Lord make a new thing, and the earth open her mouth and swallow them up with all that appertain to them, and they go down quick into the pit. And that's that word Sheol. Don talked about this Monday night. Then you shall understand that these men have provoked the Lord. And that's, of course, exactly what happened. Verse 32, the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up. What's the word, by the way, when you give human characteristics to that which is inanimate? Personification. Thank you. That's 2 classes in a row. I don't know what I'm going to do without you, Sister Katrina. Every time I forget these words that I'm looking for, Sister Katrina is there to help me out. Personification. Sometimes people say, what? The earth opened her mouth? That's just personification. It's a figure of speech. Of course, the brazen serpent in Numbers 21, this is right on the heels of Moses striking the rock when he was told to speak to it. The brazen serpent, the people are murmuring again. God sends these fiery serpents. People are dying. They ask Moses for help. Moses cries out to God. God says, make a brazen serpent, a serpent out of bronze or brass, in other words, and put it on a pole. Anyone who looks can live. Jesus references back to this in John chapter 3. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And anybody who comes to him can be saved. Numbers 21 through 25, this is where Israel is going to conquer the territory east of the Jordan. Before they cross over, there's actually a little bit of territory on the Transjordan or the eastern side of the Jordan River. They're going to conquer that territory. Numbers 34, we'll read about the death of Moses. I'd give you this very quickly. 3 historical events from Leviticus. This is a sermon I preached here some time back. I think I got most of this out of Reagan's dad's notes, or maybe even a sermon that he preached. 3 historical events that happened in the book of Leviticus: the dedication of Aaron and his sons, chapter 8, the death of Nadab and Abihu in chapter 10, and in chapter 24 you have the death of a blasphemer. People are quarreling. One of them takes the name of God in vain. And the people bring him to Moses. They say, put him in ward until we find out what the word of the Lord is. And the word of the Lord is, taking his name in vain is a capital offense. And he says, stone that man. So that's the seriousness of taking God's name in vain. Those are 3 historical events from the book of Leviticus. As you can see in Leviticus 10, the death of Nadab and Abihu is right on the heels of their dedication and being blessed by God. For whatever reason, whether it was to do with alcohol or whether it was to do with their own just stubbornness and pride, they decided not to follow what God said when they got to chapter 10. And chapter 10 is this joyous occasion. It's kind of, I don't mean to use this in a trite way or a flippant way, but it's kind of the grand opening of the tabernacle. God consumed the first sacrifice, and if I understand that passage correctly, God started the fire on the altar. And he says, you keep it going, and that's where the fire is going to come from when they offer this incense. And they didn't take it from there for some reason. More questions and lessons here. Why was the law of Moses given? We got two references there, Romans 3 and Galatians 3, 19 through 24. I want to finish 5 before I run out of time here, but what's the short answer? Why was the law of Moses given? Given to Israel, and really even now for our benefit, but for what's the end game? Yeah, it shows we need a Savior, and it leads us to the Savior. And that's really the better part of Galatians, right? I mean, Paul spends a lot of time in that book pointing out that the law of Moses was never meant to be permanent. He's pointing out there's not a flaw in the law of Moses itself. God gave it for a purpose. He designed it not to be the end result of taking away all the sins. He designed it to lead up to Christ, who would fulfill it, take it out of the way, nail it to his cross, and his blood washes away sin, flowing forward and flowing backward. Hebrews 9:15 points out it took away those sins under the old covenant. They were forgiven in promise, but they still needed the blood of Christ. God seeing, of course, everything, knowing what's going to happen, as if it's one big, I've heard the illustration of like a mural. We're on this linear line of time. And we talk about, well, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but God does. He knew Jesus was going to come, and nothing was going to stop that. What about the Gentiles during this time? Did they have a law? Were they accountable? They did. They had a law. They couldn't be under sin if they didn't have a law, right? Paul points this out in Romans 2 and 3. They weren't ignored, but this is focusing on Israel because it's all about showing us how the Messiah came. Why did the Israelites wander so long? Well, for that generation of unbelievers, 20 years old and up to die out. How many of the men numbered at Mount Sinai survived the 40 years in the wilderness? 2, right? As far as the 20 years old and upward, and that would be the ones numbered, right? 2, Caleb and Joshua. How many times was Israel numbered? Twice. Once at the beginning of Numbers, once right there at the end. And you see the change in the number from all the wilderness wanderings. I got to hurry up here. Why didn't Moses get to enter Canaan? Well, because he struck the rock when God told him to speak to it. We already talked about that. How do you explain Israel's unfaithfulness in the wilderness? Short answer here is it's a lack of faith. Bottom line, they just didn't believe God. If they had truly believed, they would have done what he said. God's demands for holy living in the book of Leviticus 11:44, be ye holy, for I am holy, God says. God's care for Israel during the wilderness wanderings. Manna and quail. He gave them manna and quail, Exodus 16:35. Manna means what? Yeah. When you put food on the table for your kids, sometimes they say, what's this? Israel goes out and they see manna on the ground, and they say, what is this? That's what manna means, literally. What is it? So he gave them manna and quail, and he made it so that their clothes and their shoes didn't wear out, from Deuteronomy 8:4, 29:5, Nehemiah 9:21. I want to show you this map I promised to show you 2 weeks ago. It's not as much as I thought. It may be because it's kind of zoomed out, but you can see the route of the Exodus. You just can't see that pointer very well here. But they come out somewhere around Ramses. We're not really exactly sure on a lot of these because it's so old. It's been so long ago. It's hard to get the exact places. Some people have them crossing here where there's barely any water. I don't know about that. But he's got them crossing right here, kind of the top of the Red Sea. They come down. Here's somewhere in this region is Mount Sinai. They're going to march. But you see all these wanderings because of their unbelief. And then finally they're going to end up here at Mount Nebo, and that's where Moses is going to view the promised land. Another look at that from a different map, a little bit larger view. These red boxes and dates, these references are from the book of Numbers. About 3 months to get to Mount Sinai, and then you have 11 months, 5 days at Sinai, or as we say, about 1 year. You've got them complaining, 70 elders appointed, provision of quail, Miriam and Aram's rebellion. 37.5 years of wandering, Aaron's death, fiery serpents here in Numbers 21, victories over Sihon and Og, that's the Transjordan. And that brings us to the end of period number 5. Memory verse is Titus 2:11, for the grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men. But it teaches us to deny ungodliness and worldly lust and to live soberly, righteously, godly, or we might say faithfully in this present age. And that brings us to the sermon for next hour. So we'll stop there. And Lord willing, we'll pick up next week, beginning with period number 6, conquest and possession. This is a period that covers a lot less, so we can go through it shorter time. May take 2 weeks, may take 1, we'll see. But we'll stop there and have a break, and then we'll gather again for worship. Thank you very much.